This is Lesson 1132, Decolonization, Independence Movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Overview. By the late 20th century, many former colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East had freed themselves from European imperialism. Decolonization is the term historians have used to describe this process of freeing themselves. So what is decolonization? It's independence movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. China is one example. Although China had its own government, it was still controlled by many foreign powers, as we see on this map. Then Mao Zedong and the communists took over China in 1949, and China became free from Western control. Here's a map of all the colonial territories that gained their independence during the decolonization period. And as you can see, it's a substantial part of the world. It's the vast majority of Africa and huge parts of Asia. So what exactly happened during this time? In some cases, European rulers withdrew from these territories voluntarily. In other cases, there were nonviolent independence movements. For example, Gandhi used the strategy of nonviolent, non-cooperation, and peaceful protest in India against British rule. And the theory behind it was that your oppressors will find it impossible to oppress you without your cooperation. So if you simply stop cooperating, they can't do it. In many cases, however, European powers had to be forced out by violent revolutions. Causes of decolonization. What forces led to the end of European empires? Education. In many cases, European rulers created their own resistance by educating native-born Asians and Africans to serve their empires. And this process gave these people the skills they needed to create and lead resistance movements against the people who had educated them. Gandhi, for example, had been educated in Britain to be an attorney. Also, the educational curriculum of European imperialists stressed such things as democracy and individual rights and Enlightenment thought. And it was obvious to these indigenous peoples that these values were not being applied to the colonies. You also had two world wars. You had World War I, and this war saw fighting in some of the colonies themselves, and many indigenous peoples served their rulers as soldiers. You also had World War II. Countries exhausted by this war were in much less of a position to maintain colonies far away. And after the Holocaust and the collapse of European society into chaos, European countries could no longer pretend to be morally superior or have the moral high ground. Then there was nationalism. As we know, this was the belief that an ethnic people should determine their own destiny with their own independent, sovereign government. And again, this was a value that indigenous peoples learned directly from their European overlords. Trends in decolonization. Decolonization began earliest in Asia, actually India. India broke from Britain and became a pattern for other colonies to follow. Leaders of independence movements were often the Western educated elite. The many differing African and Asian groups used a variety of elements in their efforts to gain independence. For example, let's compare these quotes from Gandhi versus Ho Chi Minh. Gandhi said, "Victory attained by violence is the same as defeat, for it is momentary." Whereas Ho Chi Minh said, "You can kill 10 of our men for every one we kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and we will win." Many regions of the world became politically independent through decolonization. The results of decolonization. The more educated indigenous elite often just replaced the colonial elite, the Europeans, with little change for the masses of people. Problems remained, such as economic dependency upon the West, limited industrialization and economic development, tribal, racial, and religious differences, and government corruption.